Today we're going to go over Matt Walsh ranks the top 5 most overrated films.
We're going to run down a list of the 5 most overrated films of all time.
Now remember, it's important to remember that these are the 5 most overrated films of all time. Period.
Now, this is the definitive list. There can be no argument, no discussion. We should turn off comments on YouTube because this list is so verifiably correct.
This is a bad take in and of itself. Basically, he's trying to shut down any discussion of this. If you wanted to turn off comments, he could. All creators can turn the comments off on their videos. You'll actually see a lot of times they'll say comments have been turned off on this. It's not something YouTube just does. The content creator can do it. He doesn't do it because comments generate more traffic to his video, so he's never going to do that. But when you're saying your opinion is verifiable fact, you're just wrong from the outset.
There's really nothing to talk about. Now, one thing to remember as we proceed is this. Overrated does not mean bad. So I'm not saying that the films on this list are bad. Some of them are, but not all of them. Overrated just means that they aren't as good as people make them out to be. Their reputation is greater than the actual product on the screens.
The thing is, he's not just saying these are overrated films. He's saying they're the most overrated films of all time. To be a most overrated film of all time, the reality has to be very far from the perception. You have to be perceived as a really good film, but kind of be, a poor film or a bad film to have that large gap. Because remember, we're only taking 5 films. If you said these were the 5 most overrated films that are actually good, then that would be different. But he's saying that these are the 5 most overrated, bar none.
So let's begin. Number 5, Shawshank Redemption.
Hard disagree here. Shawshank Redemption's a great film. I don't know anybody who doesn't like this film. A film's so good that everybody who watches it likes it. Pretty much, that's a pretty good film.
Now, this is not a bad film. It is, in fact, it's a pretty good film. But it has gained the reputation of a cinematic masterpiece, mostly because millennials grew up watching the movie on TNT, where it aired approximately 46 times a week.
He's being facetious with his numbers, of course. I don't think he actually believes it aired 46 times a week. But it was on TNT a lot, and the reason why is because every time they put this film on the air, it would get better ratings than anything else they showed that was a movie. Why? Because it's one of those movies that when you're flipping through the channels, you stop and watch the rest of it because it's a really good film. In fact, I bet a lot of people have never seen this thing from beginning to end. They just caught bits and pieces of it, flipping through the channels. Or maybe they've seen it once, beginning to end, but then they've otherwise. Because I've only ever seen it once, beginning to end. But I've seen parts of it several times. Only great films are a type of film that you're just going to stop and watch the thing when it's on TV, pretty much no matter what. Unless there's something else that you really want to watch at that minute. And the reason why they showed it was to get ratings, because ratings equal more money, and more people watch it, which gives it better ratings.
And Shawshank it's a fine story. It's a well-told story, but it's also incredibly cliched, overwrought, quite cheesy.
I don't think anybody considers Shawshank to be cheesy, except for maybe Matt Walsh here. I've never heard that characterization of this film. It's not cheesy in any way. I'd like to see the cheesy parts he's referring to within the movie, because it's not cheesy or campy or like that at all.
Quite cheesy, extremely predictable.
It's also not very predictable. I doubt anyone watched this movie the first time and knew exactly how it was going to end and knew exactly how things were going to go in this movie. It's not predictable.
Every character is a walking archetype. Every story beat can be seen from a mile away. The movie doesn't do anything new or different with the prison drama format.
Just because you're not new and innovative doesn't mean you're not good. The greatest of all time just means you're the best at doing something, not that you innovated a new way of doing it. I think that's something that a lot of people get confused. Like when I say the greatest, such and such is this guy because he did this first. Well, doing something first doesn't make you great. It just means you're innovative. Being great means you're doing it better than others.
Except sanitize it. So Shawshank is to prison movies what Remember the Titans is to football movies. They're both massively overrated. Not even the best versions of their particular subgenre.
This is kind of another thing. You can argue that they're not the best of their subgenre, but when it comes to prison films, the only thing I would put with the Shawshank Redemption really would be The Green Mile, which ironically was based off a Stephen King story, just like the Shawshank Redemption. Same way as Remember the Titans, one of the greatest, not only football movies of all time, but one of the greatest sports movies of all time. Now, I would say that We Are Marshall is actually a better movie, but as far as a sports drama movie or a football drama movie, it's first or second with We Are Marshall. So, arguably, they are the best at their subgenre, or one of the very best at their subgenre.
Much less are they in the conversation for the greatest movies of all time.
Actually, Shawshank Redemption is in the conversation for the greatest movies of all time, and usually, if it's sitting there in the top 5 or 10, if you look at the other movies up there with it, it's probably the best movie that'll be sitting there. I think it is. The ones I've seen it at toward the top, it's usually better than the other movies in the top 5 or 10 with it.
My biggest problem, though, with Shawshank is that the inmates are all the nicest, most decent human beings you could ever meet.
He is way off if he thinks the inmates are being characterized as good people. They're not. None of these. I mean, there are a few that are nice in the movie. Not every inmate's just going to be an absolute animal. It's just going to be, you know, criminally insane or something. Like they're not all going to be just absolute animals that are always doing horrible things to other people. Most criminals are probably bad 10, 20% of the time, and otherwise they're not. There are some that are absolute animals that just constantly can't help themselves or whatever. Plus, if you look at the good criminals in this movie, it's really Andy and like the other 8 guys he hangs out with. There's another group of bad criminals. But most of the criminals in this movie, we just don't really get into most of the inmates. We don't see their stories. We barely see them. They're just kind of extras in the movie. Most of the inmates are extras. You don't hear their story. You don't know what they're like or anything else.
Minus the 2 who are rapists.
First off, this group of guys, there's at least 4 of them. In fact, he shows a scene where Macaulay Culkin at the beginning where there's 4 of them. So there's at least 4 of these guys compared to the 8 good guys. And then the massive hundreds of ones that you have no idea if they're good or bad. And even those, it's not glorifying the good characters in this movie. They're still bad guys in the movie. They're just not as bad as these guys.
It's your world, boss. All the rest of them are kind, sensitive, friendly souls. They hang out, they play board games, they go to the library, they start a book club.
There's not a book club in the movie. The only board game they show him playing is checkers. It showed Andy and Red, which is Morgan Freeman here, playing it like 3 times in the whole movie. Andy makes a chess set, but we never actually see it being used within the movie. They do have a library, but there's no book club. You're in prison, and movie takes place in the 40s through the 60s, so my guess would be that most people in prison would read books most of the time. They would have like a movie night on there where they'd watch movies, but I bet you a lot of what's shown in this movie is pretty realistic with how prisons are. Not the way he's trying to make it out like it's some sort of utopia. It's not a utopia. It's not shown as a utopia. No one believes it's a utopia.
They run a lemonade stand out front. Not all that actually happens in the movie, but it could have happened. So if not for the evil warden and the couple of rapists, Shawshank actually seems like not a bad place to spend time. Like, it's not even clear why Tim Robbins wants to escape so badly.
The reason why Tim Robbins' character Andy wants to escape so badly is because those 2, which are actually at least 4 bad guys in there that are other inmates, I saw him several times. He's put in the hole for 2 months by the warden for really just making the warden upset. So yeah, it's pretty obvious why he would want to escape. Like, I mean, that's just a really bad take. I have to imagine that Matt hasn't watched this movie in at least a decade because he doesn't know enough, the details well enough to explain what the movie's about. He probably should have rewatched these movies before making this video. So he would actually know that it was 4 guys that were assaulting Andy, not 2. That the warden did a lot of bad shit to him that would make him not want to remain there anymore. I mean, so it's just a bad take all around on Shawshank.
So, and that takes away from a lot of the drama and the tension. Number 4, Toy Story. Now, again, a good film for what it is. It's one of the best kids' movies in the last 3 decades.
Once again, if it's one of the best kids movies ever, and it's actually maybe more than 3 decades old, it's got to be close to it. But if it's one of the best kids movies, then how's it overrated? Like, you got to rate it against what it is. It's one of the best animated films of all time. Not just the last 3 decades. I'd even argue that from The Little Mermaid through the end of the 90s, or maybe even the early 2000s, maybe about 10 years ago, up before that, that late 80s, 90s, 2000 aughts, that's probably the best era of kids' movies, other than a few of the really good Disney movies that were made back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
It's just not good enough to warrant 3 sequels with a 4th on the way.
Toy Story 2 and Toy Story 3 are great films. You could argue they're as good or better than the original. And movies get sequels, and it doesn't matter whether they're great or not. You can make that argument about tons and tons and tons of movies. Why are there sequels to them? If they think they can make money making a sequel, they will make a sequel. I'd like to see what movies he thinks warranted a sequel were so great they warranted a sequel that got one. Like, defend this position as to other kids' movies that got sequels that warranted those sequels.
No. My main problem with Toy Story is the villain, Sid, who's the supposedly evil child living next door in the first Toy Story film. But
Um,
what is Sid's great crime? Like, what did he do wrong? He takes apart his toys and reassembles them.
okay, here's the thing with Sid. This movie's told from the perspective of the toys. And from the perspective of the toys, he's the villain. It's the same way that a lion would be a villain to a gazelle on the Serengeti. The lion's going to eat that gazelle. That's a pretty villainous thing for the lion. Kind of like how vampires are villains to humans in movies because they kill them, and it doesn't matter if how the vampire sees the human. It's how the human sees the vampire. That's how the toys see Sid. But here's the other side of it. Sid's not just destroying his own toys; he's destroying other people's toys. He's destroying his little sister's toys as well.
This makes him a bad person? He didn't know the toys were alive. So how can you blame him for that? He thought they were inanimate objects. How can we blame him for his treatment of inanimate objects? Like, if it turns out that my chair is actually alive, am I suddenly a scumbag for sitting on it all these years?
I'm pretty sure that farting in your chair for decades would make you a villain to the chair if the chair was sentient. So yes, you would be a bad guy.
So, in fact, Sid is arguably a more sympathetic character than Andy.
That's a pretty crazy statement right there, but we'll let him continue.
Sid is creative. He takes old toys and turns them into...
First off, he's not creative, but just to show you, because I want to show this part again. The character we're about to show is Sid's little sister, and she's screaming because Sid destroyed her doll.
Character than Andy. Sid is creative.
That's his little sister's doll with a different head put on it. So he's destroying other people's stuff. But even if he wasn't destroying other people's stuff, Sid didn't pay for any of those toys. Someone else bought them for him or gave him the money to buy them. He didn't work for them. So it'd be like if, the government gives someone a free house and they destroy the house. The taxpayers or whoever wouldn't be able to be mad about that and say it's a bad behavior when they didn't pay for it. Someone else had to pay for that. And now someone else is going to have to pay to get it fixed because they destroyed it, which is what Sid is doing here.
He takes old toys and turns them into like new shapes and interesting creatures.
I don't think he turns the toys into are interesting. They're pretty much massive, terrible abominations. They're sadistic. I would argue that maybe even the behavior he's displaying would maybe be the type of behavior displayed by a future serial killer. I can't say that for sure because I don't know the psychology of that, but I know they do like sadistic, crazy things. If you were making these toys into something, if you're making them into like making them somehow better in any way, shape, or form, or creating something interesting, he's not. He's not creating anything interesting. He's just like making these weird, crazy things out of them.
New shapes and interesting creatures. Meanwhile, Andy forms very unhealthy fixations on his toys. never does anything interesting or creative with them. And like, there's nothing wrong with a child having a toy, but it's like it's a bit overboard. Okay, you're a little bit too old to be this attached to your toys.
First off, Andy in this movie is 6 years old. That's how 6-year-olds play with their toys, like normal ones. Sid is 11 years old. Um, so wouldn't the 11-year-old be a bit too old to play with toys? Which Matt Walsh says is perfectly fine, but and the 6-year-old be normal, which he says is completely wrong. Plus, I'd say the way Andy plays with toys is much more well adjusted. If your parents buy you a toy, I think it's wrong that you just destroy it immediately. So yeah, this is a really bad take. Like, it seems like his whole issue is that he's defending Sid. Maybe he destroyed his toys in a similar manner, so he, identifies with Sid. Who knows?
Andy.
Well, whatever, right? I mean, it is. It's just. It's time to grow up.
So it may seem unfair for me to rate Toy Story as overrated just for this reason, but this is my list and I'll do what I want.
It's like, but the reasoning he puts for it doesn't make sense as to why it's overrated. Even if he thinks that Sid's not a good villain, it doesn't make the movie a bad movie. Overrated means that the quality is lower. That doesn't make drop the quality of the movie because you dislike the choice of villain.
Like I said, we're not talking about it. Your comments are not welcome. I don't care what you think. This is just the truth. Number 3, The Dark Knight. Now, once again, good film. It just isn't the masterpiece that people make it out to be. Without Heath Ledger's great performance, this movie wouldn't be remembered for anything in particular. Like,
You can't divorce Heath Ledger's performance in the movie from the movie itself. Like, you could literally do that with just about every movie. You could say, no one would remember It's a Wonderful Life if not for the great performance of Jimmy Stewart. No one would remember The Godfather if not for the performance of Marlon Brando. You can't say, oh, you could, if you put a crappy actor in this position of a person who did a really great job in the role, it wouldn't be the same film. A character creation is half the writing, half the actor. That's how I see it. So yeah, if you don't have, Heath Ledger's performance, yeah, it's a totally different movie. But Heath Ledger's performance is part of the movie. You have to rate the movie based on what it is, not what it could have been.
Wouldn't be remembered for anything in.
Plus, it's a Batman movie. Everyone's going to remember Batman movies. They're big enough that everyone remembers them. Even the ones they don't like with George Clooney in them and Pattinson in them, they're going to remember them.
Particular. Like, take Heath Ledger out of it. What does anyone remember about this movie?
I think a lot of people remember a lot about the movie. Maybe it's a movie you watched one time when it first came out, like 15 years ago, but most people remember it for more than that.
Who cares about this movie except for that? It's great.
People actually like the entire trilogy, so like I'm not down with the entire trilogy. I think this is the only really good one in it. The other ones are just kind of mediocre, the other two in the trilogy. So I can understand, but people like the trilogy. People love Batman movies.
For that. It's great by Batman movie standards, but
I do agree it is one of the best Batman movies, but I do also agree it is a little overrated, but probably not like one of the most 500 rated films of all time. So slightly overrated, but not one of the most overrated. So I do agree on this one a little bit, but not to the extent he does.
it's not great as a piece of cinema.
I thought my jokes were bad.
For example, how does the Joker wire an entire hospital with enough explosives to demolish it in 15 seconds without anyone noticing?
We don't see how he does it. It's done off screen. Maybe he had someone going in there, or a few people going in there as maintenance men, and they were hiding these explosives around, kind of without people questioning them because they're maintenance men and they knew how to do this. I mean, we don't know how that happened. Plus, this is a superhero movie. Superhero movies require suspension of disbelief. There are things in this movie that are actually more unbelievable than this part but yeah, you could get this done if you did it over time. And to me, it seems like the Joker does have pretty intricate overtime plans. He's not just doing this stuff like 5 minutes beforehand.
This is a working hospital. People are in it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. How did you wired the whole thing? It's not even just like one part of it explodes. The whole thing is taken down.
Once again, we don't see how he did it. And plausibly, he had someone dress up as maintenance men or a few people, and they went in and did it over time. wouldn't be that difficult.
Now, get ready for the ball!
Now, the movie hopes that you won't notice that problem because you'll be distracted by, like, the moment in the hospital when Joker shows up in Two-Face's room wearing a surgical mask and isn't noticed by Two-Face until he takes the mask off.
I agree that this is pretty ridiculous, but as crazy as the entire city of Gotham is, I could see him not knowing. Who knows? He should have known. You're right here. This is pretty ridiculous.
But even with the mask on, you could still tell that he has white face paint and black paint around his eyes. So how did Two-Face, the criminal genius, not notice that? Well, maybe it's because Two-Face isn't a criminal genius in this. He's a villain for about a half a scene.
He's a villain for more than half a scene. He's a villain for several scenes in this movie. This is another have you watched this movie in the last 10 years moment? Like, I don't think Matt Walsh watched any of these for years because he just didn't really care for them. There's several scenes in this movie where Two-Face is a villain. Not just this scene. There's a scene in a car. There's a scene with the police chief's family. So there's quite a few scenes where he's a villain in here. Not just half a scene.
And then he's dead. It's like Christopher Nolan forgot to include Two-Face.
This is another one. Two-Face is throughout this entire movie. You could actually argue that Two-Face is more important to the story in this movie than Batman actually is. Like, Two-Face, Batman, and the Joker are the three main characters in this film, and none of them were forgotten at any point in the movie. That's just a bad take. Maybe he just only remembers Heath Ledger, and that's it.
To include Two-Face, they're about to put the movie out. You know, it's like a week and the movie's going to come out, and someone says, well, we forgot we're going to put Two-Face in this thing. Oh, yeah. Then they got to go back and they just add Two-Face in.
Once again, that totally nonsensical argument. There's quite a few scenes with Two-Face in it. I guess you could have did a thing where Two-Face was in the next movie and held that part. Maybe that probably would have been better. I don't really like the whole Bane thing that they did in Dark Knight Rises. So maybe it would have been better to have Two-Face as that main villain in the next film. But they're expecting Heath Ledger to come back as the main villain, and Heath Ledger had died in the meantime between movies. And they decided not to bring in another person to play Joker, and they went a different way.
And you can just take Two-Face out, and it doesn't change anything in the movie at all.
If you take Two-Face out, it completely changes the entire movie, changes the end of it. Batman takes responsibility for Two-Face's actions because he thinks Two-Face, who ends up dying at the end of the movie, has to be, the hero that the Gotham needs at the time. He has to be the White Knight. That's why Batman becomes the Dark Knight at the end of the movie. Without Two-Face, the movie is 100% a different movie. That's like, did you watch it moment by Matt Walsh?
Harvey, I'm sorry.
But
Here's another scene.
Is the end when Joker somehow wires two ferries with explosives. Again,
Once again, why would this be hard to do if you did it beforehand? This is all set up in the movie, too. Because when Joker says that he's going to do something to the city and people are trying to get out, he tells them that the bridges and tunnels can't be accessed. Like, he tells them. It makes sense because he sets it up beforehand. Why everyone's getting on these ferries. And, yeah, you could have probably wired them with explosives before you set that up. You can tell this is planned out in advance. It isn't like a seat of his pants moment.
Again, nobody knows how he did this. And then the passengers on each boat are told that they have to press a button and blow the other boat up before their own boat explodes. And one of the boats is full of convicted criminals, right? And then, of course, all the criminals band together and decide to do the right thing.
I agree that this doesn't really make sense that the criminals wouldn't. But most of the criminals actually wanted to blow the other boat up. One decides not to. Like, it's the criminals are both boats. There's people saying, hey, let's blow the other boat up. The boat with criminals in it want to blow up the citizens, and the boat with citizens want to blow up the criminals because they don't want to die because he says he's going to blow up both boats if they don't pick.
And not blow up the other boat. They said, hey, come on, guys, let's do the right. Come on, folks. Hey, fellas, come on, let's do the right thing here. Because we all know that criminals are renowned for their humanity and generosity and lack of self-interest.
Actually, only one criminal does that, and in the movie, if you watch it, like I don't know if you watched it recently, the guy that takes the switch out the button and throws it out the window, he says he's going to push the button for them. He's the type of guy that can do that. So it's actually decided on the boat of criminals that they are going to blow the other boat up. But this one guy says he will do it, and then he throws it out the window. So yeah, it's not how he's characterizing it at all. Once again, it's kind of like the Two-Face thing. It's not how he characterizes it at all.
Maybe these were all inmates, from Shawshank. Like maybe that they just so happen to be the nicest criminals ever happen to be on this boat. So the movie just didn't have the courage of its convictions. That's what I didn't like about it. Number two, Marvel movies, all of them. The whole Marvel movie canon, they are all overrated because they're all rated as being at least better than cinematic slop, which is what they all are. Okay, they're all bad. Like every single Marvel movie is bad. There's never been a good one. I hate to tell you.
Here's the thing. Now that statement, the problem with it is that he's saying they're all bad. Now, what do you think the odds are that he watched every last Marvel movie if every one of them's bad? There's like 25 to 30 Marvel movies. I doubt he watched all of them. If he watched one, thought it was terrible, then watched another one, he thought it was terrible, then a third one he thought was terrible. You're not just going to keep watching these just because. So I think that statement just doesn't even make any sense. If you watched them all, you at least enjoyed some of them. If you didn't watch them all, you can't say they're all bad.
I hate to tell you.
The original Iron Man is really, really great. So the original Guardian of the Galaxy was a real breath of fresh air. Ant-Man is wildly underrated to me. Doctor Strange 2016, again, enjoyable. And
Like I'm just saying, like like the stuff like Ben's saying here makes sense. These movies, the early ones were enjoyable.
Thor Ragnarok is just pure silly.
The Marvel superhero franchise started out with like silly, dumb movies that were silly and dumb, but at least kind of fun in a very brainless, bordering on mind-numbing way. But then as the films kept getting churned out, they got longer and longer and more redundant and lazier. Like by the end of this whole run,
I looked online after seeing this. I didn't see any, maybe it is 3 hours long, but like I didn't see any that were that long. But really, the only ones like this Avengers Endgame is like a one where they have a whole bunch of characters in it. Some of them are probably too long, the later ones. But when I watched the ones through Infinity War, I never thought they were too long as I was watching. And I noticed when a movie like to me, the Lord of the Rings movies are too long at 3 hours. I think they could have done those in a shorter amount of time, especially the Return of the King with the 9 different endings in it. Like choose an ending and go with it. So if the length was really an issue, I would have noticed it while I was watching these movies.
each movie is 6.5 hours long.
Once again, he shows what's presumably the longest one at 3 hours. None of them are 6 hours. I know he's trying to be facetious, but they're not that long. At least not the original through Infinity War, which I'm saying are not really overrated. The ones since Infinity War, most people don't like them. They are bad, but they're not overrated because they're not rated well for the most part.
And it's the same. Like somehow every movie is the same as the last one.
They're not all the same, like cookie. I mean, admit that there's the same basic premise in them. You have this superhero, has these powers. Some bad guy comes along, he has to defeat the bad guy. But you could do that with a lot of movies. You could simplify all kinds of movies that way. You could say that every gangster movie is the same as The Godfather. Because what I'm saying, they have all the same tropes and all this and that. You could do that with just about any type of movie because the very broad brushstrokes are going to be the same for all movies, pretty much.
But longer. Aside from that, the movies have no stakes.
I would. There's a point at which they stop having stakes, but I would disagree. I'm going to let them continue on that point.
And this problem became more pronounced as they started adding multiple universes and so on, until there were so many realities and so many universes that nothing that happened in any particular universe matters anymore.
I will agree that the multiverse stuff does remove the stakes from these, but that is post Infinity War. Before Infinity War, there was at least some stakes. Granted, the main superhero is not going to die in his movie. I don't think that ever happens. But There's a lot of movies that are that way. Look at the Lord of the Rings. All the fighting they do, and the only guy that dies is there's one guy that dies. He's played by an actor. Last name is Bean. The guy dies in every movie he's in, so you knew he was going to die. But all the other members of the Fellowship, the other 8, none of them die. Even if you see them dying, they come back later. Like falling thousands of feet to the ground doesn't kill you in the Lord of the Rings. Um, there's no stakes in those movies really, except that it's all of Middle Earth. The only stakes are if we don't, complete our objective, this entirety of Middle Earth is going to be destroyed. And that's the kind of stakes that superhero movies have. There aren't stakes for the superheroes as much as there are stakes for all of mankind or all the people in a certain area. That's the stakes. But like I said, the stakes in these movies were there through Infinity War, and after Infinity War, they pretty much got rid of the stakes. That's kind of, I think, when Disney took over. And when Disney took it over, they just destroyed the entire MCU.
You can kill off somebody in one universe, there's an infinite supply of new versions to replace them. So who gives a shit then at that point?
Not very bright.
In the old days, a superhero was fighting a villain who wanted to, maybe take over a city or something. But then it's like, okay, now they want to destroy a whole planet, and then they're going to destroy a whole galaxy, and then eventually he's going to destroy the whole universe.
Isn't that increasing stakes then? Like if the guy's going to destroy the whole universe or half the universe or a planet, that's an increase in stakes. So he's kind of arguing against himself, saying there's no stakes. You can say that they're building up to a ridiculous level, but there's still stakes in that.
Except that doesn't even matter because this is one universe of a trillion. And
It's okay if this is one universe of a trillion, it still matters to everyone living in that one universe. There's still stakes. It's stakes for that universe. It might not be stakes in another universe, which technically, based on what he said earlier, it would be, because if a villain gets to destroy this universe, you're losing one of the supply of all those extra people you can pull from other universes, because one of these universes no longer exists. They can do it in this one. They can do it in a whole bunch of them too, right? So like his arguments aren't even compatible with themselves.
so who cares about this universe? But the writing was so bad and so lazy that even the threat of universal destruction wasn't enough to create any real emotional investment in the story. Number one.
I would imagine that most people haven't liked him, like those movies have emotional investment in them. He may not, but I just think he doesn't like superhero movies or like sci-fi movies. Look at most stuff; it's fantasy, sci-fi, superheroes. Like Toy Story is fantasy, Star Wars, which we see, sci-fi. Batman movies and MCU, they're kind of sci-fi slash superhero, because superheroes are kind of sci-fi too. So he doesn't like those types of movies.
The most overrated film of all time is Star Wars. It's fine. It's decent. It's not deserving of the worshipful praise it receives, and it certainly does not warrant the 10 billion trillion films and shows and everything else.
To me, this sounds like he's talking about the original Star Wars movie and not the whole universe of Star Wars movies the way he did with Marvel. So it doesn't warrant the sequels. Well, actually, if you look at the way people liked the movie, it kind of did. Like, Star Wars was one of the biggest cinematic things ever. And every time they put out a sequel, people wanted more. So it kind of made sense. I mean, up through to a certain point, no longer people want more Star Wars, but that's more or less, if you put the divide kind of at when Disney bought Lucasfilms, the early Star Wars stuff, yeah, it kind of did warrant the sequels because people like them, people want them. He may not like them, but that doesn't mean that they don't warrant, the praise they get.
That came after them.
Not true.
The original Star Wars movies were solid B movies.
That's impossible.
The acting's pretty poor, especially by Mark Hamill.
I'll admit though, Mark Hamill's not a great actor, but he does a good job in the Star Wars movies. You have to remember, he's a 17-year-old when these movies start. So he can act a little childish at times, but he's supposed to. Also, the other acting in the movie is really good. Alec Guinness is amazing in Star Wars. The voice acting of James Earl Jones, the acting of Palpatine when he's in these movies, the acting of Princess Leia, Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia, acting of Harrison Ford as Han Solo. There's good acting in these movies now. Is all the acting absolutely impeccably great? No, but it's not terrible. I'm sure if he made his 5 best movies of all time, there'd be plenty to nitpick on those.
Really, really bad acting. The script is kind of cheesy and derivative in parts. And I say derivative not because, everything after Star Wars is ripping it off, so I'm just used to it. Even Star Wars when it came out was derivative of sci-fi that had come before it. It actually was not doing anything all that new.
I have to completely disagree. Star Wars is not a ripoff of Star Trek, which is what he's kind of trying to show here, I guess. I don't know what that first movie shows. It's probably Space Odyssey. But Star Wars made space-based sci-fi huge. If not for Star Wars, there would not have been these Star Trek movies. The Star Trek movies were made to capitalize on the buzz Star Wars created. They made a James Bond movie in space. Battlestar Galactica was made to capitalize on that. Not for Star Wars. So Star Wars was, you can't just say, oh, it's just derivative. It's nothing special. It was huge at the time.
But that's fine. Darth Vader is a 12-year-old boy's idea of a scary villain. Like, he's not actually menacing, and he doesn't create real tension.
This makes me think maybe he watched Star Wars when he was a kid and never watched it again. Star Wars, you could make the argument that Darth Vader's the greatest movie villain of all time. Like, this is kind of a ridiculous statement.
Like, if I'm in a room and Darth Vader walks in, I'm not going to be that scared. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not that scared. You got again with the cape. The first thing I'm thinking is, like, why are you wearing it? You're a dork already because you're walking around in a cape. You don't need.
I think if you walked into actual Darth Vader, went into a room, he would be scared. He'd be hiding in the corner somewhere. He'd probably be telling Darth Vader how great he is so he wouldn't get choked to death.
You have the cape on. And I'm just not, I'm not that scary. Sorry. Anton Chigurh walks in, I'm scared. Okay? I'm scared by that guy. A bunch of 12-year-old boys watched those movies when they came out in the 70s and 80s and loved them, which is understandable. But then they grew up and they insisted that the movies are still as great as they remember them being when they were 12. And that's the problem. Nothing is as good as you thought it was when you were 12. Okay.
There might be a bit of a nostalgia point to these movies, but there are people that watched them at older ages that like them too. The movies are still good. He probably didn't like them when he was 12, and therefore he thinks they're bad and doesn't think that they're deserving of the praise. Like I said, I just don't think it's the type of movie he likes. I think that's what the issue is.
Okay, you were 12.
Okay. All right. You think you could do this to me?
And Star Wars is the same way. Now, you all need to grow up and realize that.
The answer is never. Do you hear me? Never, ever.
Well, the thing is, he says you need to grow up. Well, most of these movies are movies that would appeal to people under the age of 18. You have Star Wars, Marvel Universe, Batman, Toy Story. So maybe he just doesn't like movies that are aimed at, maybe only likes movies that are aimed at like adults. Because only one of these movies he puts on here is The Shawshank Redemption. So maybe it's just his taste in movies